turned the book in, Knopf hated it. They said that they would publish it, but only after they had taken out all the negativity. What they wanted was a mythic version of the American press, without fear and favor. It's been done. Watergate, Pentagon Papers. And I do think that the collapse of the mainstream press, and especially newsprint, is catastrophic. But I wasn't going to write a book that did not explicate the failings of an institution that I knew far better than Knopf. And so I frantically searched around for a publisher who would take the book as it was, and Nation Books agreed to do that. So they paid off Knopf. And as we were discussing the book, one of the problems that I ran into when I was writing it was that it was trying to write about the press in a vacuum. And you know, there's a reason that the press doesn't cover labor anymore, and that's because the labor movement in this country has been decimated. What's left of it, we are watching be dismantled. I live in New Jersey, Chris Christie, of course, Wisconsin, Ohio, everywhere else. And I decided at that point to broaden it, to look at all of the pillars of the liberal establishment, not just the press, but education, culture, universities, especially public education, labor, and the Democratic Party. Because I think that the collapse of the press has been mirrored by the collapse of the pillars of the liberal establishment. And that's what has led us to this frightening predicament that we now live in. One where powerful anti-democratic forces are steamrolling over the rest of us. And we have almost no organized mechanisms by which we can fight back. And I wanted to look at how that happened, which of course stretches all the way back, as Joe knows, to World War I and the Creel Commission, and we can talk about that later. But right. That's how the book came into being. And I'm much happier with it because I think it's a much richer exploration of the issue, because of course the press hardly exists in isolation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to deal first with questions of definition. Towards the beginning of the book, I think in the first chapter, you identify classical liberalism around a cluster of values, namely individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, and meliorism. That is the capacity for the improvability of the human condition through the employment of critical reason, okay? But as you view it, who, if you can be more specific, who indeed are the carriers of these values today? In other words, who constitutes the liberal class that has eroded, and where is it to be found? You mentioned a few organs of liberalism, but I was wondering if you could be more specific about whom you're talking about when you talk about the liberal class.
Well, I mean, the tragedy is that liberal institutions no longer protect these values within American society. That's the problem. And those solitary figures who stand up and do protect those values, one thinks of Ralph Nader, have become pariahs. Ralph is hardly a bomb-throwing radical. He's a very close friend of mine. And yet he has been pushed utterly to the margins of American society, because unlike the liberal class, unlike liberal institutions, he held fast to traditional values of liberalism. And so those voices that continue to speak, Dennis Kucinich would be another one. I mean, the idea of Dennis Kucinich as a radical. Dennis Kucinich is a Robert Kennedy Democrat. But the political landscape has become so disfigured. The range of acceptable political opinion, to steal a line from Dorothy Parker, goes from A to B. What on structural, economic, fundamental issues of power, what difference is there between David Brooks and Thomas Friedman? None. What difference is there on the major structural issues
of power between Barack Obama and John McCain? None. Or between Barack Obama and George W. Bush? None. And so what we have seen is, in the name of careerism, we have seen our liberal institutions embrace a system of unfettered and unregulated capitalism that mocks the very values liberals purport to defend. Those of us who care about the working class in this country should have walked out on the Democratic Party in 1994 with the passage of NAFTA. And yet we continued to support political figures that trampled on the very values that those of us who are cognizant of what makes a functioning democracy possible should have been defending. And Clinton didn't just stop with NAFTA. He's responsible for the destruction of the banking system, the deregulation of the FCC, which allows frightening configurations like Clear Channel to run thousands of radio stations across this country, the destruction of welfare. That was all Clinton. We worked hard, many in this room I'm sure worked hard in 2006 to elect Democrats to retake control of the Congress, which was a campaign. Those campaigns were built around the Iraq War. And what did they do? They continued to fund the war, back the war, indeed increase the troop levels in Iraq by 30,000. So the inability on the part of the liberal establishment to protect liberal values has created a very frightening scenario, because coupled with it has been a removal of the legal mechanisms by which the working and middle class in this country was once protected. And although you have figures like Obama who continue to speak in that feel your pain language of traditional liberalism, they carry out policies that that are completely at odds with the very values they claim to espouse and promote. And that's very, 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 very dangerous. And I lived through the collapse of Yugoslavia, when the liberal class is important in a society because it functions as a kind of safety valve. It makes possible piecemeal or incremental reform. When there are large injustices and grievances within a society, you have a mechanism through the formal structures of power by which those injustices can be redressed. When that no longer works, when that's shut down, when all of those people who are having their houses foreclosed or repossessed, all of those bankruptcies over people who can't afford their medical bills, the perpetuation of a kind of permanent underclass with no serious effort to create a jobs program, when none of that is addressed, then you begin to see the political configurations that we are seeing, which is irrational, violent. I'm thinking of the Tea Party, militias, and the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party. The political agenda that they hold up as a solution is utterly irrational. The idea that we get government off our backs but nobody touches Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare, the idea that we support our military as if the military isn't part of government. This is what demagogic and totalitarian movements do. It's what happened in Yugoslavia. It provides a kind of emotional outlet for people who have a legitimate rage, a rage that is not being expressed by the liberal class. The liberal class continues to speak in the dead language of policies and issues, and it has as its target, which is what always happens, traditional liberalism, because the hypocrisy of the liberal class has been unmasked. And unfortunately, I think that the rage towards the liberal class is not misplaced, but with that rage comes a rage towards the values that purportedly are defended by the liberal class. And I happen to care about those values.
Yeah. Well, let me pursue that a little bit more. I mean, clearly your thesis, in effect, has two parts. One is that the corporate state has taken over The corporations have taken over. But the second component of your thesis is that the liberal class has basically colluded with its own destruction. And in fact, you seem, in some cases in the book, to target the liberal class more head-on than you do, in effect, the forces on the right, the corporations that have done this. But let's leave that aside. How has the liberal class colluded with its own destruction, and how has it enabled itself to be co-opted, and why?
Well, that's why I go back to World War I. And as Dwight MacDonald, a writer I admire very much, wrote that World War I was the rock on which populist and radical movements broke. That with the rise of an unpopular war, fought because Wall Street had lent tremendous sums to the British and the French, and were terrified that in the event of a German victory, this money would not be paid back. Wilson, who I think comes across as a very dark figure in American history, created the first system of modern mass propaganda, the Creel Commission, or the Committee for Public Information. And it saturated the country, not only with pro-war propaganda. It had its own news division where it churned out daily news stories that were had to be printed in papers across the country, its own film division that pretty much paid for itself, making movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin, used speakers bureaus, graphic artists. But aside from the reach of the Bureau, it employed the understandings of mass psychology that had been pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and Freud. And Edward Bernays comes out of the Creel Commission. Bernays was Freud's nephew twice over, between his mother and his father. And Bernays' book, Propaganda, becomes one of the Bibles that Goebbels picks up when he creates the system of modern mass propaganda used by the Nazis. And they understood that people were not moved by reason or fact. They were moved by the manipulation of emotion. Walter Lippmann, in his 1922 book, Public Opinion, which becomes a kind of manual by which this is carried out. And Lippmann was one of the prime movers behind creating the Committee for Public Information, talks about manufacturing consent, the way you manufacture consent. And the system of mass propaganda was not only used to promote the war, but to destroy these radical movements. Most of ends up in prison. It's how the Wobblies are broken. Publications like Appeal to Reason, The Masses, Espionage and Sedition Act, which interestingly enough are not really employed in any large way until after the war is over, when the dreaded Hun instantly becomes the dreaded Red. So you had a moment in American history, certainly right on the eve of World War I, when liberals actually did represent the center of the political spectrum. And so they had radical movements to keep them honest. We saw with the breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s a good example of this. You had massive sit-down strikes, a resurgence of the Communist Party, and the New Deal. And as Conrad Black correctly points out in his biography of Roosevelt, Roosevelt's greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism. And there the liberal class functioned. It held off the radical movements by creating enough reform to mollify large segments of the population that have been disenfranchised. That's why in a capitalist democracy the liberal class is important, because it sets the parameters by which reform or change is possible. And it also demonizes radicals themselves. That's why traditionally liberals are tolerated in liberal religious institutions, in the universities, in the press. That is their function, something the corporate state is too blind to figure out. The figure that traditional liberals hate most in this country is not Glenn Beck. It's Noam Chomsky, because Chomsky calls them out on their collaboration with the power elite. The liberal class, for instance, when you have huge members of the self-identified liberal class, David Remnick at the New Yorker, Bill Keller at the New York Times, Michael Ignatieff, all these figures supported the invasion. And when everything went sour, and they did their retrospectives, the way they critiqued it was to say, we weren't prepared for the insurgency, we didn't understand, we didn't have enough troops for the occupation, but they don't critique the motives of Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, Pearl, these figures who propelled us into war. Because when you do that, then you cross the line. You step beyond these parameters that were very well defined when I worked for 15 years in the New York Times. You knew that when you crossed those parameters, you would immediately be expelled from these liberal institutions, as I was. So the liberal class was decimated, one, by the destruction of radical movements. So therefore, it had no real pressure from the left anymore, from populist movements, and from the internal purges, the witch hunts that were carried out in the name of anti-communism, that decimated these organizations, destroyed the labor movement. Meany, Lane Kirkland, all these figures, driving out, purported communist sympathizers, the physical destruction of the Wobblies. Joe Hill, of course, executed. Big Bill Haywood flees the country on trumped-up murder charges. The decimation of thousands of university professors is accelerated, of course, in the 1950s with the McCarthy hearing. Social workers were a big target, high school teachers, the ACLU. You look at what all liberal institutions collaborated, and they didn't drive out people who were necessarily communists. They drove out people who had moral autonomy. This became a weapon in the hands of careerists. So they lost the radical forces that had kept them honest, and then they disemboweled themselves. So that with the rise of the corporate state, the unfettering of the regulations that had kept corporations in check, we were utterly disempowered. We had neither the radical movements nor the robust liberal movements by which to fight back, which is what has allowed this coup d'etat in slow motion to take place.
Yeah, what I want to do is actually look at some of the historically liberal institutions that you discuss in the book and go through them one by one to talk about the process of co-optation that you raise. Okay, let me start with the universities. How have they been co-opted by the corporate class?
Well, I've taught at Princeton. It is a corporation. Universities, public education. I mean, Rockefeller started it when he destroyed City College. We educate our elite, and the rest of us are educated enough to function in the kind of caste position by which we are assigned by the corporate state. You take elite universities like Princeton. Goldman Sachs is in there recruiting after sophomore year. They bring them in for the summer. They put them in apartments. They give them lavish internships. And then they graduate, hired as consultants, and make $120,000 a year. I can assure you that they're not equipped to consult you on anything, but that's how the system works. And I had to sort of grit my teeth under Obama's State of the Union speech when he talked about how we were lagging behind because of education. We're not lagging behind because of education. The people who robbed the country were the best educated people in the United States, including Larry Summers. The problem was human greed and people who used their analytical intelligence to turn on the rest of the country and create this leviathan of an oligarchic class. I mean, top CEOs are pulling down $900,000 an hour. 40 million Americans live in a state of poverty. Tens of millions of Americans live in a state of near poverty. So what's happened is that we have seen, and I was just talking with my friend Patty, who teaches high school up in Harlem, we have seen an open assault against, of course, teachers' unions, the rise of charter schools, and as Patty was pointing out, you should be deeply suspicious when the biggest backers of charter schools are hedge fund managers, because I can assure you they don't give a damn about the education of your child. We have seen only 35% now of professorships are tenure track positions. Most people who graduate, especially in the humanities, become itinerant workers. Mm-hmm. They work as adjunct professors. They are paid a pittance, They often have to take on 3 or 4 different teaching positions to survive. They are not given benefits because they're not considered full-time workers. And then when you have a tenured position, which is diminishing, there's a book by an Ohio State professor called The Last Professors that I read recently that was pretty good on this. You tell departments that they have to raise their own money, their own research money, and often their own salaries. Well, is Goldman Sachs going to fund the classics department or the literature department or the philosophy department? They will fund those departments that don't ask the kinds of questions. Look, the whole idea of an education is to make you ask, if you go back to the Socratic idea of education, is to make you ask questions about assumptions, about structures, about your society, to teach critical thinking. And any discipline that teaches critical thinking is under complete assault. Because on the elite level, they want to create systems managers, people who get funneled to Wall Street, the managers and manipulators of the system. And on the rest of the level, they want to create people who are trapped in economic desperation and are taught primarily to obey. And we are seeing an utter collapse of the educational system, both in terms of public education and in terms of private education, because these universities fall all over themselves for money. College presidents are chosen and rewarded solely on their ability to raise money. And most of the people they are raising money from should be in jail. Speculation in the 17th century was a crime. You were hung. George Soros would have been hung. I like George Soros, but what he did as a speculator was a crime, which is all Goldman Sachs does. They don't make anything. It's all casino capitalism and all speculation. And so, our elite are trained to run systems. And I think Larry, just to give longer than you want, I'm sure, but Larry Summers is a kind of poster child for it. He has this bizarre analytical ability. He was the youngest tenured economics professor at Harvard, and yet the common sense of a 12-year-old, in the same way that Alan Greenspan does. Never trust anybody who thinks Ayn Rand is a great writer. And these people don't understand human nature. There's nothing in 3,000 years of history to support the absurd idea that we should be ruled by the dictates of the marketplace. It's almost utopian in its vision. And of course, we're now in the midst of watching the collapse of globalization. That's what we're watching. That's what we're watching in the Arab world. You could even throw Japan in there. Rising commodity prices, rising fossil fuel prices, reconfiguration into a clone of global neo-feudal. That's what we're watching. And these people don't know how to respond. A figure like Summers, they only know how to serve a dead system, which is why they loot the US Treasury to the tune of, by the time everything's added up, trillions of dollars, $12.8 trillion, because they're not capable of thinking. The only thing they know to do effectively is to serve this system at our expense. So the danger is that you allow, it's not like we had a choice. The danger is that these figures, who are in many ways illiterate, control our fate. My close friend Richard Thomas, who's the head of the classics department, the backstory is Richard had been the leader of SDS at Berkeley in 1968, and Summers' first speech when he became president was to the Harvard Club in London, in which he said the decline of the British Empire was caused because the British spent too much time reading Latin and Greek. Well, he just picked the wrong person to fight with, and Richard immediately started mobilizing to drive Summers out of the university, which eventually they did. One of the things Summers did, a lot of people don't know, and you don't have pity for Harvard, but he appointed Robert Rubin to the Board of Overseers. And not only did he destroy $40 trillion in global wealth and $17 trillion in wages and retirement benefits for American citizens, he destroyed 50% of the Harvard endowment because he and Rubin were buying up toxic mortgages as an investment. And these are the people who have our fate, in their hands.
Well, as a former, what can I say? I guess as an ancient Greek major in college, I feel redeemed.
Well,
I don't
there
know
you
what
go.
else to, yeah.
Let me just put a pitch in for the classics.
Yes.
I think the classics is the most important discipline. I also speak as a classics student because you're forced to articulate ideas in another language.
Right.
And I think people who walk seriously out of classics departments have some of the sharpest minds in the country. And yet, classics are dying. I mean, the University of Albany just killed their classics department. I just spoke at the University of Washington, and they had 10% budget cuts. They have this gleaming business school, and I can guarantee you everything they're teaching in there about laissez-faire capitalism has no correlation to the reality we live in. And what did they do? They cut the theater department and the philosophy department.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Any discipline that has the capacity to transform is destroyed.
I want to move on. Sometimes it's said that the churches are the last bastion of what Cornel West refers to as non-market values. And we might look at them as liberal values. And yet you see the contemporary religious world in America as being co-opted as well. Can you sort of elaborate that process?
Well, the liberal church, which I come out of, my father was a Presbyterian minister, and I went to divinity school. All mainstream churches are divided. They're divided between an aging, traditionally liberal constituency and a growing evangelical constituency. I come out of the Presbyterian church, but just about any church, Methodist, even Episcopal, they're all suffering with this. So the leaders of these churches are trying to hold together these disparate factions and not offend either one. And so they say nothing and do nothing. They retreat into this sort of how is it with me spirituality, which is just a form of narcissism.
Okay.
They forgot that the issue is justice, but more importantly, they forgot that Christian heretics exist. What's the point of going to seminary for 3 years, as I did, and studying the Christian gospel and the teachings of Jesus Christ, and getting out into the wider world and seeing a figure like Joel Osteen or Pat Robertson who are inculcating the Christian gospel with the worst aspects of American consumerism and militarism and self-exaltation, and remaining silent. And I think the greatest failure of the liberal church is that it didn't find the stomach to fight back against these figures and denounce them for who they are, which are Christian fascists. The idea that Jesus came to make us wealthy is sacrilegious. Think when Jesus died, all he owned was a robe. It is the idea that once you walk out into the wider world, you wouldn't have to fight for the radical message of the gospel is naive. And the liberal church and many of these churches, remember, they left the city with white flight. They moved out to the suburbs. So you're running a church out in Greenwich, Connecticut or something. You don't want to piss off your congregation, all of whom are taking the train into New York City to disembowel the rest of the country during the week. And so you talk about garbage. I mean, you talk about nothing. You talk about amorphous concepts. And at the moment, we so desperately needed a moral voice. And people who graduate from seminary are actually trained to speak in that vocabulary. We found liberal religious institutions without the spine to stand up for what they should have stood up for. And therefore, when you even say the word Christian anymore in this country, people think of these whack jobs. that have created quite a frightening system by the way of information. Christian radio and television has hermetically sealed tens of millions of Americans in this country. And I did a book on the Christian right called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I was trying to reach out to them. And I spent 2 years sitting inside this stuff. And it's a very important, Hannah Arendt, who I worship, I just taught at the University of Toronto this fall, and once again taught Origins of Totalitarianism, which is just a stunning work. But she makes the distinction in totalitarian movements between propaganda and indoctrination, that what the public sees are the systems of propaganda. So that when you turn on your TV and you see, Joel Osteen with that sort of used car, like Carsman smile, or Haggard, or any of these figures, you're not seeing and it's very true, because I went into these pro-life seminars, these creationist seminars. I actually took a seminar with D. James Kennedy at Coral Ridge for a week. It's called Evangelism Explosion, where you learn how to bring people to Christ in 20 minutes. And it was one of the most fascinating chapters of the book, because it's so cold. There's nothing about, it's all about targeting people who've just lost a loved one and is suffering from grief, just lost their job, new to the neighborhood, divorced, i.e. people who are broken and vulnerable. You use the techniques of cults. You go in groups of 3. Margaret Singer, who wrote the great book Cults in Our Midst, calls it love bombing. This person's lonely, vulnerable, and the 3 people are hanging on every word they say. You draw them into the organization. You cut their contacts with their traditional circle of friends, community, even family members. You assign them a discipler so that they don't backslide. I mean, it's when you get on the inside of it, and people who have been raised in the evangelical church can tell you this, and the trauma that they've experienced. It is cultish, but you don't see that. You have to get beyond the propaganda into the systems of indoctrination where they break you down. And it's really, truly, truly, truly terrifying. And we have to remember that, again, as Hannah Arendt pointed out, or Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies, the engine of all totalitarian movements is despair. It is those people for whom the real world no longer functions. And when you interview, as I did, dozens and dozens of people, I spent 2 years on the book and traveled all over the country. When you interview these people, the stories you hear are heartbreaking. Severe financial distress and dislocation, struggle with addiction, substance abuse, domestic violence, sexual violence. I went to a pro-life weekend in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where at the beginning of the weekend, it was all for women, and they asked all the post-abortive sisters to stand. Almost the whole room stood, several hundred people. And when I went around and did the interviews, most of them had multiple abortions. And what they do with these retreats, with these women, is they take them away for a weekend, and they give them a doll. And they tell them that this is the child they've murdered. And they have to dress and carry this doll and sleep with the doll and name the doll for the entire weekend and bathe the doll. And then at the end of the weekend, they have to hold the child up that they have murdered and beg for forgiveness and promise to spend their lives fighting the culture of death, which is us. If you don't get inside, this is not seen by the outside public. And once you get into these systems, you realize how pernicious the leaders of this movement are, how they manipulate shame, guilt, but most importantly, they promise people who are in desperate situations a world of magic. They remove them from the reality-based world, which is what all totalitarian movements do, and promise them a world of miracles, where God and Jesus will intervene in their life. And as you create larger and larger pockets of despair, as people realize that not only is their future not bright, but the future of their children is not bright, which is what's happening, then they become more and more susceptible to these movements. And once you remove them from a reality-based world, you can't argue with them. You can't have a rational argument with somebody who believes that there were dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden. I went to the Creation Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky. They have spent hundreds of millions, tens of millions of dollars on it. The first place you go is a replica of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve standing in a waterfall. I mean, Eve sort of turned so you can't see her breasts or anything. And there's saddles on the dinosaurs. And the guide is explaining to us about how, well, if everybody loved each other in the Garden of Eden and the dinosaurs weren't flesh-eating, why did T-Rex have such big teeth? Well, T-Rex had very large teeth because T-Rex was used to open the coconuts. And then you move on to the Noah's Ark room and that thorny question of how did the dinosaurs get on the Ark is raised. And we're told that Noah only put baby dinosaurs on the Ark. Well, see, in this room it's funny. But when you're standing in the museum where everyone believes it, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. And the only way to re-enfranchise these people back into the society is through money, is through jobs, is through the capacity to give them once again a life with dignity. The only solution to this movement is economic. And of course, what's happening is the opposite. People who cannot endure much more are having the screws tightened and tightened and tightened. I mean, we're watching mothers show up to the doors of Head Start programs, and they're not sure whether the door is going to be open this morning. And when you fuel that kind of despair, and it becomes that widespread, then it becomes impossible to protect an open society.
It's very powerful. There are other areas I want to talk about, but our time is running on, and maybe others will ask it from the floor. I wanted you do discuss media, for example, and the arts, and how they played a progressive role, but indeed are being co-opted as well. But it caught my eye that you were really extraordinarily prescient when you identified, quote, employees in public sector unions as one of the last havens from the onslaught of the corporate state. And this was before Wisconsin. I'm wondering if you can comment on what's unfolding in Wisconsin and elsewhere and how that conjoins with your thesis.
Well, Wisconsin is an example of how far we've fallen, because remember that what they're fighting for in Wisconsin, collective bargaining, is not anything that directly affects the working conditions of public employees. It's the right to ask. It's the right to ask for decent working conditions. That's how far we've descended. And the vilification of teachers has become a mechanism. The idea that somehow teachers are all welfare queens has become a mechanism to obliterate. I mean, it's got a kind of double goal, to obliterate not only unions, but to obliterate decent public education itself, so that you'll end up with the kind of itinerant workers in public schools that you have now within most universities. People who can barely make a living, people who probably, at least if they have a choice, will not choose it as a profession, people who increasingly are not trained. Correct me if I'm wrong, Patty, but isn't it's Clinton's education secretary who's talked about how he doesn't think there should be certification, right?
Obama's. Yeah.
I mean, Obama's, yeah.
He is questioning
Right.
certification.
I mean, I think that,
He stated that he didn't seem to have much support.
right, I mean, that's the next step. And of course, I mean, I had a very peculiar existence because at the age of 10, I got a scholarship to a very elite boarding school. And so I was raised around the ultra rich, which is why I hate them so much. I went to school with dozens of George W. Bushes.
You know, in this room we find that funny. In a different context, it might be very frightening.
Yeah, I mean, so those people, I mean, my prep school had the facilities of a small college. I went to the prep school the Rockefellers went to, and they gave a lot of money to it. It's staggering. And so what is given to the elite and what is given to the rest of us, the gap is now becoming so vast that there's no way that a bright kid in an inner city school has any chance at all. It is recreating a kind of frightening caste system by which the elite, the plutocracy, perpetuates itself, and the rest of us remain in our place.
As we know, Chris Hedges, you've spent much of your career documenting the horrors of war. When we take a look at the wars being waged now and waged in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's estimated that close to 1 million human beings have lost their lives as a result of violence. We're approaching that number. And that it's estimated the United States has wasted over $1 trillion prosecuting these wars. And yet, as you point out, our former National Security Advisor, General James Jones, has stated that there are probably fewer than 100 al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan, which of course was the rationale for initiating these wars to begin with. Can you elucidate for us, and this is of course a very leading question, whose interests are being served by the prosecution of these wars, and how indeed has the military been privatized?
Well, war is a good business. That's nothing new. There are a lot of powerful corporations in this country, Raytheon, Halliburton, Northrop Grumman. They don't give a damn whether we're losing the war, winning the war, make any difference to them. They're still raking it in. And they control the policy. So, I mean, even the Pentagon's having a hard time hiding the fact that we're losing the war in Afghanistan. But they have a vested interest in never leaving. They don't care how many Afghans die, how many American kids have their legs blown off. It doesn't matter to them. Look at all of these private contractors. Their stock prices have quadrupled since we began these wars. And because so much of the military is privatized, my friend Jeremy Scahill did a study of there are 18 intelligence agencies in the United States, and 70% of their work is outsourced to corporations. And when they're not working for the CIA or the Pentagon, they're working for themselves or for foreign governments. We have handed the most sophisticated forms of internal and external intelligence to private corporations. And if you want to see them work, go to the G20, as I did, because it was just eerie how they shut down every single group. They blocked the email communications. Anytime anybody was going to hold an action, they never managed to get to the spot. Infiltrators everywhere. When I was in Pittsburgh, they brought back a National Guard battalion from Iraq in full combat gear, and they militarized the center of Pittsburgh. I mean, they turned the center of Pittsburgh into the green zone. They had sophisticated forms of crowd control, including this machine that would make these sort of sonic-type booms. It was totally disproportionate to the I mean, most of the people protesting in Pittsburgh were retired Quakers in sandals. But it was a message to the rest of the country, which was, don't try this. And so the fusion of the capacity of the state to control the citizenry or handing that capacity to corporations has meant that should there be a period of unrest, and I believe that there will be a period of unrest in this country, the forms of draconian control that have been given to these centers, unelected centers of power, will be very scary. And that's why these wars are going on. There's a lot of people making a lot of money. Not a lot. There are a few people making a lot of money off of this, and the national interest is irrelevant.
You state in your book that, quote, war and violence as instruments of virtue are a contradiction in terms, and yet you seem to imply elsewhere that you're not quite an absolute pacifist. And this takes us a little bit beyond your book, but in that regard, what is your view of so-called humanitarian intervention, and specifically the events that are currently unfolding in Libya?
I break with the peace community on this. I supported the intervention in Bosnia. I was there in Sarajevo. I supported the intervention in Kosovo. I was also there. I believe that the lesson of the Holocaust is that when you have the capacity to stop an active campaign of genocide and you do not, you are culpable. I believe that we should have intervened in Rwanda. I believe we should have intervened in Cambodia. I think that when large numbers of people are being massacred and you stand on the sidelines and do nothing, you are complicitous in their murder. And I just had dinner in Canada with Roland Delier, who was the Canadian general in Rwanda, tried to kill himself 3 times after he's left, wrote a very good book called Sup with the Devil. It wouldn't have taken much in a place like Rwanda. Shut down the radio station in Kigali, we could have stopped that. Instead, 800,000 people died. 3.5 years in Bosnia. I was in Sarajevo, 250,000 dead, 4,000 children killed in that city. So my anger over the Iraq War was that that argument of humanitarian intervention was used by the liberal class to justify the invasion. Now, I had covered for the New York Times the massacres of the Kurds, and I was in Basra after the end of the first Gulf War during the Shiite uprising. Until I was captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard. I like to say I was embedded with the Iraqi Republican Guard. And we were complicitous as a country in both of those acts of genocide. We gave Donald Rumsfeld, gave $500 million in agricultural credits to Saddam Hussein at the height of Anfal. We sent in technical advisors to create command and control, that is, the ability to coordinate ground and air assaults together, which was very complicated in the war with Iran. And during the Shiite uprising, where we had renegade army units in the south, and when I was a prisoner, we were ambushed by one. It was 16 hours of fighting. We allowed Saddam Hussein to put his helicopters back up in the air because we did not want a Shiite-controlled Iraq. And that wasn't lost not only on the Shiites, but on anyone else in the Middle East. So when the liberal class started talking about how he kills his own people, well, these people were already dead. And not only were they not already dead, but we had a part in their deaths. So part of my anger towards the attempt to justify the invasion into Iraq on humanitarian grounds was that I had actually been in Iraq when we had done nothing to stop the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people by Saddam Hussein's regime. In the case of Libya, I know Libya. I've interviewed Gaddafi twice. It's always interesting to interview these figures, not for what they say, it's fairly predictable, but to get a sense of who they are. And Gaddafi is a very frightening figure. He's numb. There's no question in my mind that should he have retaken Benghazi, he would have killed in the same way Hafez al-Assad killed when he had the Islamist uprising in Hama, 10,000 dead. So therefore, I do support intervention. That said, there are so many ways it can go wrong. There are so many ways it can be used on the part of imperial powers in a way that it wasn't meant. I'm not naive to any of that. On the other hand, it is my judgment as somebody who spent a significant amount of time in Libya that the threat to thousands of Libyan citizens, should Gaddafi have retaken Benghazi, which he clearly could have done with the armored columns that he had outside the city, was real.
In the little time that I have left for myself, I want to sort of change the tenor of our discussion. You present a very powerful analysis, and in some ways, it's a dark analysis. You state explicitly at various points that you think that totalitarianism is on the horizon. And of course that doesn't sit well, I should say, with the reader, and therefore one grasps for counter dynamics, one looks for germs of hope and so forth. And I sort of want to press you, Chris, on some of those things. You say at one point that we have to adopt the language of class conflict and rebellion, yet you do not seek to reappropriate, let's say, a Marxist analysis in that regard. Can you elaborate for us on the use of class conflict as a tool to leverage change in what you think is the needed direction?
Well, I'm not a Marxist in that I'm probably, if I don't like labels, but I'm probably an anarchist in that I believe that the health of any society, I come out of the Julian Benda vision of the world where those of us who attempt to speak in a voice that cares about those bedrock issues of freedom and equality must always be perpetually alienated from power in whatever form that it exists. And that's, of course, Camus as well, that rebellion is a kind of permanent state, as opposed to revolution, which seeks to replace one power structure with another. I think that, as Benda points out, that you have justice and truth opposed to privilege and power. And that the closer you move towards privilege and power, the further you move away from the issues of justice and truth. That those of us who fight for justice and truth, if that is what we see as giving us meaning, must accept that we will perpetually be outside formal structures of power. And I think that all of the true correctives to American democracy came by people who never achieved formal political power. Whether it was the Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. And yet you could argue that by 1968 the most powerful figure in the United States was Dr. Martin Luther King, because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. And I think that that's part of the disease of the left, or the liberal class, that we forgot that it's not our job to take power. Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, says the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. According to Popper, most people attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do you stop the powerful from doing as much damage to you as possible? And I lived in Paris, I watched it. Sarkozy is a cretin, but he's terrified of the French students and the French labor unions. Imagine if the French announced that university students would have to pay $50,000 a year to go to college, the whole country would shut down. And we forgot that. We forgot that. So, I don't even remember what the question was.
I'm not sure I do either.
All right.
But let's move on to the next one, which is related to it. You cite certain paradigmatic individuals, both historical and more contemporary, as positive exemplars, people whom you admire. Among them are the early social critic Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, who I'm happy to say was identified with our movement to some extent, Eugene Debs, Emma Goldman, Bertrand Russell. More recently, Noam Chomsky, Dorothy Day, Ralph Nader, whom you cited before, and Daniel Berrigan. And so the question I want to ask is, what qualities do these people exemplify that you feel stand against the cowardice of the liberal class and therefore express virtues that need to be emulated at this point?
They understood that resistance is built around a moral imperative, and if it's just them standing out there, they'll do it. You know, I read, and I put this in the book, I read Howard Zinn's 400 pages of his FBI file when it was released. And there's a moment in there where the FBI agent who's following around Zinn talks, Berrigan is a fugitive. And Zinn organizes a rally in support of Berrigan in front of the police station in Boston. And it's pouring rain, and only 70 people show up. And in the FBI file, they ridicule Zinn for the poor showing and for the fact that he's standing there in the pouring rain. Now, reading that years later, I love Howard Zinn. And, and maybe at that moment I loved him more. And, there's and I'll get personal in a sense. My father was a Presbyterian minister and a remarkable man. I grew up in a small farm town in upstate New York. And he was a very vocal supporter of the civil rights movement at a time when in rural white enclaves, Martin Luther King was probably one of the most hated men in America. He had been a sergeant in North Africa in World War II and deeply opposed the Vietnam War. He told me when I was about 12 that if I was drafted, if the war was still going on and I was drafted, he would go to prison with me. He died in 95, but I still have this vision of sitting in a jail cell for 2 years with my dad. And he was very outspoken, and this was in the 1970s, of the gay rights movement. His youngest brother, my uncle, was gay and lived with his partner in Greenwich Village. And my father had a particular sensitivity to the pain of being a gay man in America in the 1950s and the 1960s. And when I was an undergraduate student at Colgate University in upstate New York, my father had a church in Syracuse. And when he found out there was no gay and lesbian organization at my college, he drove the gay speakers to my campus. And I would sit around in small, and I have to confess, I was probably one of the most committed heterosexuals at Colgate. I would have to sit around with my dad and these gay activists, talking about another way of being, another way of believing. And when, after several of these sessions, gay and lesbian students confided in my father that my father kept pressing them to form a public organization, confided that they were too uncomfortable coming out in public. He drove down one day and took me out to lunch and told me that I had to found it. So I founded the Gay and Lesbian Alliance at Colgate. I never went. I used to go into the dining hall, and the guy would take my card and check it off for breakfast, lunch, or dinner and hand it back and go, faggot. So I made it my undergraduate mission to seduce his girlfriend. The importance of that is that, did I succeed? My mother tells me to stop telling that story. The importance of that is that when you have a figure who stands up, and my father was driven out of one church after another, especially on the gay rights issue, I think even more than the civil rights issue or the anti-war issue. And he was pretty much blacklisted by the Presbyterian Church, and he was a great preacher, incredibly charismatic, and at the end of his life, the only job he could get was as a chaplain at a juvenile facility. Now, that everything I do in my life is measured by the standards that he set. And when I publicly denounced the raison d'etre for the invasion of Iraq, and I did this on shows like Charlie Rose and all sorts of national programs, I ran into the buzzsaw of the New York Times until I was booed off of a commencement stage at Rockford College. You can watch it at YouTube. It was worse than being booed. They cut my microphone twice. The crowd stood in the middle of my talk and started singing God Bless America. People were weeping. Two men, after 18 minutes from the graduating class, tried to come up and shove me off the podium. They escorted me off the platform before the awarding of diplomas because they were worried. They didn't want the students to come in close proximity with me. I had an academic robe on, and when the security took me off, I said, but my jacket, it's in the president's office. They said, we'll mail you your jacket. The paper the next day ran a headline that said, Rockford College graduation speaker disrupts commencement. And of course Fox got a hold of it, and they ran the home video, and they lynched me just the way like they lynched my friend Jeremiah Wright, just like and what they do is they turn you into a figure of ridicule. They don't challenge your ideas. It's what they do to Nader, it's what they do to Kucinich, it's what they did to Jerry. That's how they go after you. And so I'm called into the New York Times. and I'm given a formal written reprimand. We're guild, which means that you get, the process is you get the written warning, and the next time you speak about, next time in my case, that I got up and spoke publicly against the war in Iraq, I would be fired. And I'd been given my warning. Now, I'm not going to pretend it was easy, nobody wants to lose their job, and yet, I knew as I sat in that office that I had two choices. I could pay fealty to my career and muzzle myself, but to do so would be to betray my dad. And I quit. And when I walked out of that building, I think I articulated for the first time what my father had given me, and that was freedom. I didn't need the New York Times to tell me who I was. I didn't need any institution to tell me who I was. And the reason I admire the figures you listed, including Nader and Berrigan and Chomsky, is because, like Dorothy Day, like Eugene Debs, they held fast. They have held fast to these moral imperatives, like Howard Zinn standing in the rain with 70 other people in front of that Boston police station. And you can never underestimate the power of moral witness, ever. I just want to tell one story from Bosnia, which is in my first book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. I covered the war there for 3 years. And I was interviewing a Serb couple, Drago and Rosa Sorak, who had been in the safe area, the Muslim-controlled safe area of Gorazda. Like many ethnic Serbs, they had supported not the nationalists under Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, but on this multi-ethnic fabric that was protected in places like Sarajevo, Srebrenica, Jepa. And they had two sons, one of whom left to fight with the Bosnian Serbs. He was killed in a car accident. And another son, Drago, who stayed in Gorazda with the family and his wife and his parents. And as the siege got tighter and tighter, and they were shelling Gorazda, it was, no food, no electricity, no power. It was the suspicions against Serbs became heightened, and the Muslim police came, took Drago away. He disappeared. They never saw him again. 10 days after he, or I guess a few weeks after he disappeared, his wife gave birth to an infant girl. But because of the shelling and lack of food, she was unable to nurse the child. And they were giving the baby weak tea, and it was dying. And after 10 days at dawn, there was a knock on the door of their apartment. And it was a Muslim farmer named Fazil Fadic in a pair of rubber boots, illiterate. And he gave the family a liter of milk. He had 3 brown and white milk cows that he could only milk at night because of the Serb sniper fire. And he came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, until everyone in the apartment building realized, and remember, milk was worth the price of gold, that this farmer was keeping alive this little Serb girl. And they would start to insult him and spit on him and tell him to let the Chetnik babies die and give the milk to the Muslim children. And he did this for a year until the Soraks were able to leave Gorazda. I heard the story from the Soraks. And despite all their anger towards the Muslims, because of course they had taken away Drago, when they told me this story about beginning, and they said, but it is our duty to tell you that not all Muslims are bad. And they told me the story of Fazil Fadic. So I immediately went into Gorazda to find him. And his 3 cows had been slaughtered for the meat towards the end of the siege. His apartment building had been bombed out. He was sleeping on newspapers with several other men on a concrete floor of a building that was rubble. They were collecting worm-eaten apples from an orchard and trying to sell them for some money on the street. And when I told him I'd seen the Soroks, he said, "And the baby, how is she?" Now, for me, that's a perfect example of the power of moral witness. Because what he did, I believe, reverberated outwards throughout that whole community. He kept alive another narrative, another way of being. There is a little girl growing up in Bosnia, a Serb girl, and she may never meet him, but she will know that she's alive because of a Muslim farmer. And I think that these acts of witness, for those of us who care about the moral life, create a kind of invisible presence that empower us. You know, there's a wonderful story in the Gospels. All the disciples walk out on Jesus at the moment of crucifixion. They all do. And yet 3 weeks later, 3 of the disciples are called before the court of Sanhedrin, and they profess who they are and accept what looks like an inevitable death sentence. And I think that there's a word for that. It's called resurrection. I mean, I often say that you hear my voice, but in the end, it's my Father's words. And I think that when we hold fast to those moral imperatives, and I've seen it in moments of fear, in moments of apathy, in moments when everybody seems passive, that ability to stand, in fact, is about the sanctification, perpetuation, and protection of life against forces of death. And I think that's what we forgot. And that's why they work to make us afraid. Because once you stop being afraid, once you are willing to take those kinds of stands, once you hold fast to that moral imperative, no matter what, no matter how many people show up in the rain in front of it, then you begin to harness a power that terrifies the dead hand of authority.
We simply have to end at that point. Thank you so very much. Okay, we have a little bit more than a half an hour left. Hopefully we'll continue to engage your attention and interest. This gentleman over here. Please be brief and please make it a question, not a statement.
Right. The Washington Post had that Top Secret America report, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So would you comment about that? It was about a year ago. They said there's
Yeah, I read it.
thousands
Yeah.
centers spying on
Yeah, this was Dana Priest.
Right.
Well, I mean, it was an amazing piece of journalism and a truly terrifying insight into the security and surveillance state. And with the rise of the corporate state always comes the rise of the security and surveillance state. Because a bankrupt power elite, which is who holds the reins of power in this country, governs through fraud and force. And once the fraud is exposed, as it is being exposed, force is all they'll have left. And they'll use it. And I think that that series did probably the best job of any piece of it's worth going online to read. It's a 3-part series on how uncontrollable and vast this network of internal security has become. And let's not forget that, courtesy of Barack Obama, tens of millions of Americans are being spied on. They're having their phone records and email records stored. This is what the FISA Reform Act was about. It was about not only legalizing what under our Constitution is illegal, but retroactively legalizing what had been illegal, because there were about 30 cases against telecommunication companies like Verizon and AT&T who had turned these records over, and they knew they were going to lose. So they walked in there with, I think, an estimated $21 million, handed it out to our compliant political class of both the Democrats and Republicans, and even Barack Obama came back and voted for it. You know, let's not forget that the major accomplishment of the Obama administration is to codify the destruction of domestic and international law, including the refusal to restore habeas corpus that was put in place by the Bush administration.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Abe?
Do you see any hope in the protests in this?
I'm going to be in Wisconsin tomorrow night.
In Madison, speaking. Hope, yes, but only if it expands and they succeed in seriously disrupting the systems of power, which I think will mean a general strike if they can pull it off. I'm very worried that if they manage to crush Wisconsin, it will have a kind of deadening effect across the country. I think Wisconsin is extremely important. We have to begin to challenge, as they have in Wisconsin, all of the mechanisms of power, if there's any hope left. But I'll have a better feel for it, you know, after I come back. But I think it's certainly a hopeful sign, yeah.
This gentleman in the back there who's standing up. You go ahead. Yeah.
Chris, since the last time I saw you on the boat to raise money for the boat to Gaza, I saw that web movie, 9/11 Mystery, and I became completely convinced that there was official complicity in the destruction of the Twin Towers and Building 7. I wonder if you agree with this now, if it's a battle that you think we should fight, if it could be won, and if there are consequences to winning this battle. It took me a long time to become convinced of this, by the way.
I learned as a reporter a long time ago not to pass judgments on things I hadn't reported, and I haven't. This is not something I have reported. So I'm willing to leave open that possibility. If you ask me for my personal opinion, and this comes from somebody who invested months and months of their life reporting on Al-Qaeda, I think that Bush was just asleep at the switch. I think that that the attacks of 9/11 would have never happened without Mohammed Atta. That you look at most of the hijackers in those last few hours got very cold feet, and it was Mohammed Atta who sort of pushed them. That's my personal opinion. I was also in Times Square when the planes hit and grabbed a bunch of notebooks and walked down the West Side Highway, so I was down there when Building 7 went down. Anecdotally, I can only tell you that the firefighters who I interviewed said that they had gotten into Building 7, and firefighters, of course, are very attuned to the stability of structures, and they said they all knew it was going to come down because of the attacks of the two other towers. But all of that said, I know that there are people who, engineering reports, and I have not invested time in it, so I'm speaking from an opinion that I've not reported, and therefore I could be wrong on.
Yes, this woman in the back there? Yeah.
Well, you said in terms of the fight back against our march towards fascism and other things that are going on in this country, do you agree that maybe continuing to just mobilize marches to Washington is not the best use of all of our efforts, and that perhaps not just Wisconsin a general strike, but that we need to be upping the ante for a nationwide general strike and hitting the corporations in their pocketbook, linking their associations with the government, financial attack, other tactics than those that we've used time in memoriam for the last 40 years. I want your opinion on that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, but I don't think that should preclude. I was at the demonstration in Washington in front of the White House on Saturday, organized by Veterans for Peace and Iraq Veterans Against the War, and so I think that's important. But I do think, we have to up the ante, because in theological terms, corporations are systems of death. They commodify everything. They commodify human beings, and they commodify the natural world, which is why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. They exploit each until exhaustion or collapse. And they are quite literally killing the ecosystem on which human life depends. And nothing will stop them. The industrialized governments showed up at Copenhagen and shredded Kyoto, and then went off to Mexico and did nothing. We're all sitting around pretending that it's not happening. And you know, the coal companies, the fossil fuel, none of these companies are going to do it on their own. It's clear that the power elite is not going to intercede to make them do it, and therefore it's up to us or we're finished. The consequences of climate change and which we're already beginning to see, will mean turning huge tracts of the planet into uninhabitable wastelands with incredible misery and death and suffering, and yet we're not responding. I mean, there are great people like Bill McKibben and others out there, but this is truly of crisis proportions. Even if we stopped emitting carbon emissions today, and I think parts per million we're already up to 350 is sort of, you know, what maintains life as we know it. I think we're up to around 392 or something, 388, I think. And even if we stopped at all carbon emissions today, global scientists talk about how we still inevitably would raise that. So, yeah, we don't have time to wait for them.
Jim? Yeah.
You've made pretty clear what you think of the Tea Party on the right, but say what you will about it, it has been very effective in moving the entire conversation, the political conversation, both in the Republican Party, the right end, yeah, to the right. What would you say about an equivalent movement on the left, as vociferous, as insistent, as obnoxious as the Tea Party, to move the Democratic Party, which after all is the only realistic possibility of opposing some of these horrible transitions that we're facing? But what would you say about a left-wing movement equivalent to the Tea Party to move the Democrats back to where they belong?
Well, I don't have any faith in the Democrats. The problem is that every time the elections roll around, all of the critiques or the prescient critics of the Democrats are made to feel afraid, and they trot into line and vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is. And I'm not pretending that some of these figures who run against the Democrats aren't frightening. They are. My argument, and the argument in this book, is that that has been a policy that has failed. That by not holding fast to these moral imperatives, we have allowed the destruction of a system of democracy that once functioned because there was no pressure on the corporations. And I didn't vote for Obama. I voted for Nader for that reason. And yet, when I went around the country and said that I was voting for Nader, people would hiss and boo and walk out. Kucinich, who smelled out Obama a long time ago, told me during the primaries, and I supported Dennis in the primaries, he said, look, just read his voting record. Just get the 2-year voting record of Obama in the Senate. It's awful. It's one corporate giveaway after another. And you got to turn off your TV and just read the voting record. I mean, it's all there. I have some very good friends with Jeremiah Wright, and nobody knows Obama probably better in this country than Jerry. Obama knew nothing about the African-American experience when he arrived in Chicago, and it was personally through Jerry that he learned. He was taught. And Jerry's anger is the anger of the betrayed. He feels that Obama gave up on every purported value that he claimed to support and defend. And so I think that unless we regain a kind of militancy, and I think voting is a pretty minor part of it, but I think unless we regain that militancy, there's no hope. And we have to stop being made afraid. It hasn't worked. The continuing support of the Democratic Party has only furthered corporate abuse and malfeasance. And I highly recommend Sheldon Wolin's Democracy Incorporated, which says, I think correctly, that we live in what, and I think he's probably our greatest living political philosopher, taught at Berkeley and later at Princeton, we live in a system of what he calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that he means that it's not a classical totalitarian structure where you have a demagogue or a charismatic leader and a radical party overthrowing a decaying power structure and replacing it with another. But in inverted totalitarianism, you have, through the anonymity of the corporate state, forces that purport to pay fealty to the Constitution and electoral politics and the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet have so corrupted the levers of power as to render the citizen impotent. And I just think when you look closely at what has happened in pieces of legislation, whether it's Obamacare, whether it's FISA, you know what our jobs bill has been, if it passes, what it is? Does anyone know? It's $6 billion in tax credits for corporations. That's how our jobs bill has been rewritten. It's endless. I mean, and I think that that Wolin's right. And Wolin argues that what has kept the populace passive is credit and access to cheap manufactured goods. Mm-hmm. Well, the credit is gone. I actually called Sheldon a few months ago. He's quite ill now, but we had a long conversation about this. And I said, look, if that credit is gone, as it is, if those cheap manufactured goods are no longer cheap anymore, do these mechanisms, the loss of these mechanisms of control, mean that the system could revert to a much more classical form of totalitarianism? And he said yes.
This gentleman over there, yeah, with the mic.
I'm gonna gather all my moral fortitude to ask you this question. Mitt Romney just returned from a trip to Tel Aviv, and Sarah Palin is visiting Israel. The question is, what is the role of Tel Aviv in shaping the United States presidency and its foreign policy? Thank you.
Well, the Israeli lobby is a powerful lobby that functions as all other large, powerful lobbies in that it buys off our political class of both Democrats and Republicans. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. 2 years of that I lived in Israel. I think that the road that Bibi Netanyahu and Kadima and Likud has led Israel down is one that is deeply self-destructive to the viability of the Jewish state. AIPAC is, in fact, not a friend of Israel at all, nor do they pretend to be an Israeli lobby. Remember that they are a creature of the Israeli right wing. I covered the election for prime minister when Rabin ran, and AIPAC was flying or organizing protests outside his house and giving all sorts of money to Likud. And when Rabin won and became prime minister, he didn't invite AIPAC or any of the other major Israeli lobby groups to the inauguration. And Rabin, who was a character, but when he came to the United States, I heard this from someone in his office, he was at the Shoreham Hotel or something on his first trip as prime minister, and he said that the heads of AIPAC and I don't know, some of the other groups wanted to meet with him, and Rabin said, I don't talk to scumbags. So they have a kind of, a death grip on policy towards Israel. But for those of us who come out of the Middle East, it is one that is not only not in America's interest, but I don't think it's in Israel's interest. Israel can't get up and move to another part of the globe. It is where it is, and either it learns to get along with its neighbors, and that, of course, includes the Palestinians, or in the long run, demographically and every other way, it's finished. Politics is good. Nationally, I just think there's so many ways. I mean, look at what the Democratic Party did to Nader. You know, what happened? Nader ran in 2000. He built a real grassroots movement. The Democrats freaked out. They challenged, Patti Smith and I were going around trying to raise money because the Democrats challenged all his voting lists as over $1 million in legal bills. They demonized Nader, blamed him for the loss of the election, which also was another example, I think, of the incapacity on the American public to face the truth, which is that the election was stolen. They only recounted 2 counties in Florida before they put a stop to it because they knew Gore won. Gore even says now that he won. And the Democrats, I mean, Gore never mentioned global warming. You know, he never talked about the assault on the working class. He couldn't even carry his home state of Tennessee. And so, but they really did effectively marginalize and destroy Nader. And the systems of propaganda are so powerful that, and we all got fooled by Obama. Obama was just a brand. He functioned the same way. Remember a few years ago with Benetton and Calvin Klein, they had people of color and HIV. That's all Obama was. And that's why after he won the election, he won Advertising Age's top annual award, Marketer of the Year. He beat Nike, he beat Apple, I'm serious. Because the professionals know damn well what happened. So on a local level, but I think more importantly, and maybe this woman in the back was getting at this, we have to begin to sever ourselves from the tentacles of the corporate state. Because the more we can sever ourselves physically from their control over how we live our lives, I think the freer we become. So third parties on a local level maybe, but the idea, the Green Party is pretty dysfunctional. At least every Green Party event I've been to. I don't, I will never vote for a Democrat. I'm in there in local elections in New Jersey. I'm voting for like the revolutionary socialist. I don't even know who these people are. I don't care as long as they're not a Democrat or a Republican. So, I mean, but I'm just mucking up the system. So I think part of the problem is that, I was had dinner a while ago with Dan Berrigan, and I asked him if he was following. It was during the election, and he quoted his brother Phil, who said, if voting was that effective, it'd be illegal. There are much more important things. I think a lot of people vote and they walk out the door and they think they've done their civic duty.
Let's say Manhattan cable. That's the problem, is that the average person, I just got laid off myself and I just got my email address today. The average person does not have access to, the death of liberalism. When I gave this to one of my friends who like Oprah and stuff. Who is this guy? Is he running? Why doesn't he the average person does not have access to this information that all of you have access to. And I think, to me, a lot of it is because of people like yourself need to get the average public on the internet to these websites. Even if you have to give them a computer or something like that, if that is going to be your mode of expressing yourself to internet. Because I read a lot of your books in Borders downtown. And Borders is closing, they're selling the fixtures.
Yeah, I know.
So I just posed that question to yourself.
Well, I think you raise a good point. I think you raise a really good point, and that is that, the problem with the internet is that if you're proactive, the internet's great. But most people are passive consumers of information. They get it off TV. When I covered, for instance, Serbia, when Slobodan Milosevic was there, he didn't care about, they had a magazine called Vreme, which means truth in Serbian, and they would do things like put Milosevic on the front and make him look like Hitler, and he didn't give a damn. Just the intellectuals and the sort of, the petit bourgeois class in some of the wealthy suburbs read it. What he cared about were the airwaves. And the airwaves, just like in Serbia, are in total control of corporations. I mean, literally, Viacom, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, General Electric, Disney, they control probably 90% of what most Americans watch, see, listen to, and that is extremely hard to penetrate. You know, it's almost like we have to do it one person at a time. We're at a severe disadvantage. I mean, it's really interesting that the last two books that I wrote, The Empire of Illusion, the one before this, was #1 on the nonfiction bestseller list in Canada for 6 weeks. Because when I go to Canada, I get on CBC, national broadcasts. I have a platform nationally that I don't have here. And I think that you touch upon a very important problem, that you know, the constriction of systems of information is now so severe that there is no legitimate debate anymore. I mean, it's all about the narcissism of minor difference, to steal a line from Freud, and in powerful systems of propaganda, that becomes a problem. And I've lived in other countries that have those systems, and I think we've replicated those systems.
Right. How many people still want to ask a question? Okay, I see two more, and we'll end at that point. Yes, over here. Yeah, we got a mic for you.
Well, it gets on videotape.
I've been in the labor movement for 30 years, and I work for a public sector union in New York that represents the City University faculty. So I'm watching Wisconsin very carefully. I'm very scared about what's going to happen to unions, public sector unions particularly, but that will have a negative impact, of course, on private sector unions. What do you think, or where do you see the union movement going in this country right now, being attacked on many different fronts, and will they have a role in our society going forward?
Well, the public sector unions are the last readout, really. Only 12% of the American workforce is unionized, and most of those are in public sector unions. Traditional unions like the AFL-CIO or United Mine Workers, they've just been giving away, it's just a matter of concessions. They've lost that broad social vision that unions used to have. The attack on public sector unions is sort of the last strike against popular democracy on the part of the corporate elite. And they have quite effectively demonized public workers by ingeniously twisting the argument to say to non-unionized working and middle-class people, look at all the benefits they have. Look at their health care, look at their retirement. You don't have that. Why are you giving tax dollars so that they can live in a way that you can't? And of course, it's the wrong question. The question is, why doesn't our working class or our middle class have these? And I've been working a lot in the southern coal fields of West Virginia for the next book. And all of these activists against mountaintop removal, you know, people put salt in their gas tanks and fire bullets through their windows, and because when you reduce people to that kind of level of desperation, then you fight over the scraps. And that's what they're doing. And you, unfortunately, all of the systems of mass media and mass propaganda are stacked against you because they are owned by corporate interests that want to destroy you. And propaganda works because the masters of propaganda understand that they can make a public confuse how they are made to feel with knowledge. And you can't actually have any kind of a rational debate, even on things like MSNBC. Everything is reduced to 30-second, 40-second sound bites, carnival barking. Essentially, you're just lobbing cliches back and forth. thought-terminating cliches. Nobody's opinion is changed. Nobody is given a fair hearing. So you'll have to fight back, but the forces, the broader forces within the public arrayed against you and that will be mobilized against you will be really scary.
Yes, one final question from the floor back there. Yeah. No, the woman back there had her hand up before. Go ahead.
Unfortunately, I haven't read your book yet, but I found your analysis really fantastic this evening. One thing that is sort of nudging into my consciousness about what can we do. It's not, I agree with you that Democrats, Republicans are the same. Ralph Nader, I went to a talk with his last year, and the trouble with Ralph Nader, it's not only organizing people and saying the right message, it's learning to reach people in a new paradigm. Ralph Nader is an old fogey. He talks in a very boring way. He's in the right place, but you have to also be in tune with the change that's coming in our culture. And it's more than, let's see how I can say this. It's not just getting on Facebook or Twitter, it's being able to actually have a different kind of personality than the people from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Our old liberal values became trite and empty. People mouthed them, but they didn't feel them anymore. And that's why it's so easy for the corporations to flush them down the drain, so to speak. So I think what we need to do, and I wish there were people thinking this way, is we have to try to think not in a terribly conniving way like Bernays did with the American corporations and advertising. I'm an admirer of Adam Curtis, by the way, his documentaries. And they're very brilliant, and he goes into very deep questions about it. We're trying to make the person into it.
Excuse me, can you bring a question to a close?
Yeah. So what people or what avenues have you thought of to explore approaching a more psychological level? I don't know if I've been able to express that.
Well, I think what you're upon is the shift from a print-based culture to an image-based culture. And that culture rooted in print, which Ralph represents. I hope you didn't find him too boring. I wrote Ralph's major policy speeches for him. I thought they were really scintillating. What you're talking about is a very, and Neil Postman and others have written about this, a very scary shift, because the people who control the images control your ability to perceive reality.
Marshall McLuhan is one of my
McLuhan got it.
And there's a book, his last book, which was published posthumously, is about the 21st century. And
All right, let's not get off on McLuhan because he sort of flipped out at the end.
well, I want to say is that it's a change psychologically. We've been so left-brained, so marginalized, so heartless. We can drop bombs. The Bush.
Yeah, ma'am, I think you've made your point. I think it's
No,
fairly...
the point is that we're trying to get more of the qualities of the librarian.
Okay, thank you.
Well, the parameters of communication, as McLuhan understood, or as Postman understood,
determine how you communicate. And I know, because I've worked in print, I worked for NPR, and I've had to deal with television. You cannot actually, the way the airwaves are configured now, it is impossible to actually communicate ideas because ideas by their nature are contrarian. They shatter stereotypes, and they require explanation. And when you live in a society that functions at warp speed, when you are beset at all waking hours by electronic hallucinations, you can't think. And that's the way they want it. Mm-hmm. And thinking requires reflection and solitude. It requires being rooted in a print-based culture. And I think part of my fear is that as that print-based culture dies, there's almost no mechanism left. Because think about it, we are utterly awash in lies all day long. And you have to build walls to keep, I don't own a TV, but even I can tell you that, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but it's even with those walls, I can tell you that Kendra is now dancing with the stars, what's it called? Dancing on the Stars or something like that. It's really, I don't want to even know who this woman is. And yet, if you're in an airport, which I'll be tomorrow morning, you're bombarded with this crap. Charlie Sheen, or whatever the mini drama of the week is in Celebrity Meltdown, and I wrote a column, you can go look at it on the Truthdig website, they have them archived, but it was wondering, were we going to end up like Huxley, Brave New World, or were we going to end up like 1984? Well, it turns out, I think, that Huxley and Orwell were both right. First, we had Huxley, where we descended into a kind of orgy of hedonism and trivia and absurdity, and then while we were being utterly stripped of power and all capacity, not only to control our destinies, but even to make viable incomes, and then we get Orwell. Mm-hmm. I sort of decided I'm just going to go down with Ralph, because I'm not going to stop speaking out of that print-based tradition, even though I understand that it's increasingly marginalized. I won't go on Fox. They begged and begged for it. Now they've stopped. I don't want to do 6 minutes on CNN. My publicist who's here calls me the NPR whore. Or maybe it was Michelle who said that. But if it's Minnesota Public Radio at 2 a.m. for an hour, I'm there. Because I need time. Mm-hmm. You need time to communicate ideas. And, I'll just end by, we mentioned earlier that I was booed off this commencement stage, and afterwards, even friends of mine said, well, you should have, you can go see the speech, it's pretty blistering against the war. They said, well, you should have been more moderate, or you should have tried to reach out to more of the crowd. And there was 1,000 people there, and 6 students sent me letters thanking me. And I said, no, I was only speaking to those 6 people, the rest of them could go fuck themselves.
Hopeful note, we'd like to invite people to stay for refreshments. Chris Hedges will be here to sign.
him, Ross.